Hi, everyone. My name is Mihir Wanshu, and I'm a member of Fantasy Book Critic. And joining me today for a very special discussion of the War Eternal series by Rob J. Hayes is Philip. Philip is an assistant editor and blogger over at the Fantasy Hive. He also does,
Actually,
yes,
if I may, I
yes,
used to be an assistant editor. I'm actually no longer doing stuff with the Fantasy Hive, but I love the folks at that blog,
mm,
especially Nils, Jonathan, Beth, and everyone else. So a very fine place to read up on fantasy books.
yes, and thank you for that correction, Philip. My apologies. And he does review books and video games on his Grimoire Reliquary blog, and he has his own YouTube channel. So, Philip, welcome. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm doing excellent, and I cannot wait to jump into talking about Rob Hayes's War Eternal.
Yes. This is something that I discovered that, I'm always on the lookout for folks who love to talk about Rob's books because I'm, similar to you, I'm a big fan of his. And one of the things which I've come across recently is that, there's a lot of curiosity about his War Eternal saga. The War Eternal saga, for those who might not have read it, it began with this book, Along the Razor's Edge. This is the hardcore edition. There is a different trade paperback edition and as well. So, Philip, before I want to get started with you first. And can you tell us how you came across these books? Did you read them when they were released? Did you read them later on? How did you discover him?
I definitely read the first three books long before. Well, I say long, but it's not exactly ages before they were released. It was a couple of months before
Hmm.
each book was released. So I reviewed one of Rob's prior books, maybe in 2018,
Hmm.
and we had a nice working relationship, if you will. So we started having a bit of a correspondence, and he sent me the War Eternals early review copies. And those, just the first book, the one you showed, Along the Razor's Edge, it took my breath away
Hmm.
because Eskara was quite unlike most modern day or really any fantasy protagonists out there.
That is true. And I know Rob kind of likes to describe her as Marmite, saying that either folks will love her or they'll hate her, but you can't ignore her. Look, do you think that's a true statement?
Yeah, no, I definitely don't see how anyone who ends up reading those books could have feelings that can be described as lukewarm towards Esker. Esker is someone you will feel with, you will feel for, you might feel against, but
Mm-hmm.
you will never be like, doesn't
Escahu.
matter. No.
Yeah,
She's
that's
gonna leave an
true.
impression.
Oh yeah, she definitely is. I must say that I wasn't the biggest fan of her like in the first book because I remember reading it as well and I was like, oh boy, this is really a dark one, and of course the settings are like really horrid as well. For me, I started enjoying her as a character more from the second book onwards, which is I believe the Lessons Never Learned. Uh, was this the case for you? Maybe was this the or she stuck with you from the first book onwards as well?
I will say she definitely stuck with me from the first book onwards because of this narrative distance that Rob uses in portraying her narrative style, her point of view.
Hmm.
Because we've got this Esker who is much older
Hmm.
than the Esker we actually see on the page, the Esker who is doing the actions that we follow in Along the Razor's Edge. This is an Esker who is long since removed from this horrible prison, the pit that is the
Hmm.
setting of the first book. And she is very much aware of the weaknesses of her younger self, the mistakes that this
Hmm.
younger self has made. And in that way, I immediately had a sort of emotional and also intellectual connection with this
Hmm.
older Esker who was so very perceptive of her
Hmm.
mistakes.
That is true. And you brought up this really fascinating point. for our viewers, we are going to be this discussion about the War Eternal series is going to be as non-spoilery as possible. Of course, we will be explaining, we'll be talking about some thematic things, but it's going to be a follow-up discussion on Philip's channel, which will be full of spoilers, and we will be joined by the author Rob J. Hayes as well. So please be on the watch out for that, which is going to happen soon. But what I wanted to bring this up, this point, Philip, which you brought, like, when so I believe there's like, if I'm not wrong, in the first book, there's kind of like 3 timelines, so as to speak. Eska is describing her time in the pit, which supposedly is was in the past. But then she also goes further back to how it all began for her before the pit. And of course, the omniscient voice that she's using, throughout the books, so as to speak, is at a certain time point in the future. I don't know about you, but I wasn't smart enough to get that in the first time I read that. I was like, I thought, oh, there's only 2 timelines. But then it took me a while to realize, oh, wait a second, there's more than 2 timelines. There's definitely more happening. Was it the case for you? Did you happen to maybe grab on it from the start?
No, I really enjoyed that aspect of it, because it showed a really clever amount of foresight from the point of view of the author, Rob Hayes. And it's a game of sorts that really it risks to alienate the reader, because it is complex, it demands attention, but it is also an incredibly rewarding strategy, both for the reader and for the author, once you do end up realizing just what the rules of the game are, as it were.
And let's talk about Eska more. Now, you and I both know that Eska is going to be, she's basically described as a ball of anger and energy. That's how she begins, and that's how she is in the pit. Rightfully so, because, she, and again, this is in the blurb, it's not a spoiler, that she's described as a sorcerer, which is a really cool magic system, which we'll get into a little while from now. And that she's been imprisoned for basically no fault of hers, or maybe if you look at it from the other point of view, yes, she's a horrible person, but her anger is kind of what leads her or her anger is kind of tied into her drive. And I felt that really basically made the story such a powerful, potent one, because it kept on powering the story ahead and ahead and ahead. Was that the same for you, maybe, or did you have like a different perspective about her anger or something else which drove her?
No, I definitely felt that her anger was the defining characteristic to begin with when it came to Eska. And it is such a powerful engine for storytelling, because even in the moments when she knows she shouldn't, it is stronger than her. She is someone who is controlled by her emotions. And to that effect, it's really fascinating to see her, first off, there's this implicit promise that something is going to change, right? So it's fascinating to try and see where this change is going to manifest. And you don't know when you pick up the books for the first time. Is it going to happen along the razor's edge? Is it going to be something that she will have to work towards in one of the follow-ups? And, we're not going to tell any of the viewers, but that is a question that Eska asks herself often enough. And the answer is not clear to her, not any more than it is to us.
It is not, and that's a theme throughout the books, each and every one of the books. Like, Eska, you kind of get to know a little bit about what's potentially going to happen, but you never really sure, is it really going to happen that way, or is it something else? Because that's when you find out like what really did happen, because she has one of these monikers, the Corpse Queen, and that was something which was revealed in the first book itself. Like, there's something's going to happen, and she's going to be called the Corpse Queen, but we never really found out like why she's the Corpse Queen until much later as well. I love this cool thing about the books, like, that she essentially is telling you a story, but then you realize when she's really retelling it, how much different it was and how much wilder it was, so as to speak. Besides Eska, now, where, and again, because this was really funny that, this was like a sole POV story all throughout each and every, all 5 of the books. Like, you only get Eska's viewpoint in the past, in the future, and even to that omniscient voice. But because with her being such a potent character, where it can be a little bit tricky to enjoy the story, but even in this case, we do get these side characters as well, who either are against her or are with her, but they still are they're not two-dimensional. They're more than that. Was that the case for you? Did you find anybody whom you enjoyed a lot more, or perhaps were like hoping that they would get like a viewpoint as well?
No, I have absolutely no issue with having just a single point of view character. And the cool thing here is I'm going to step away from the secondary characters for a moment and
Sure.
just return to the fact that we've got Eske, whose point of view is very immediate, but then there is the removal, this older Eske who is actually recounting the stories. And so in a way, it's almost like a dual two in one, if you will, sort of split stream of consciousness, which makes it very interesting. But the secondary characters definitely don't in any way feel, to me at least, as one-note characters, as characters who were two-dimensional in any way. No, I'd say that they are, most of them, certainly, very well realized characters. And of course, there's always characters who are one-dimensional in literature. But that doesn't, I think a lot of conversations, they try and put it in our minds that if a character is one-dimensional, that character necessarily has to be bad, when a one-dimensional character written well can be just as good as any three-dimensional character. But that's neither here nor there. That's more of my professional opinion.
That's perfectly all right. And no, there are certain characters, like you only get to see them from like the viewpoint of Eska's hatred, like the guy who's enforcing Eska and Yosef's pain, like who takes them to the pit to further down, and and making them just dig. Now he's essentially a one-note character, in a way, because you only see him as like torturing them, and nothing beyond that. But he's still an excellent focus for us to kind of feel Eska's hatred and why that is.
And absolutely, if we expand on your example, one of the really cool things about him is he is not just horrible human, one-note horrible human being. There is variety to the way in which he inflicts pain. And you believe that a human being could exist that is very much like this character, one that drives all its pleasure from causing pain and inflicting pain.
That is very true. And I'm sure there was like, maybe if you got a multi-POV story, and if he were shown his POV, there would be a reason for that, or maybe he was told to do so. But yes, you're essentially right in that. Is there, with Eska, we often talk about like her being her being anger, but there's also intelligence to her, and especially this kind of we get to see that intelligence much more ahead in the books. But from your perspective, Philip, because again, you are a writer as well. You do in your day job, you also do writing. How was the writing? From a reader's perspective, it was really fun because, again, but this can be subjective as well. But from an objective perspective, what do you feel about Eska written as a character? Because again, so much of the story is just powered through her lens.
Well, I definitely cannot, say that I'm super objective because I love these books. But I thought that the prose, Rob Hayes' prose, is a thing of beauty, a thing of dark beauty in some moments. Certainly in many moments of this trilogy, this series, but it is, it took my breath away several times. And I don't have the paperbacks or hardcover novel versions. I have the Kindle ones, but I probably have highlighted hundreds upon hundreds of passages, and they're just, the prose clicks and it lingers on in your mind, if you will. And that is the strength of any good fantasy novel, can be judged by how often you go back to the different quotes that just stay with you.
That is there. And she talks a lot about, her pain, her memories, and, how her anger kind of manifests as well. Now, I mentioned the duality, I recall you mentioned the duality aspect. For readers who haven't read the books, when you read the first book, you specifically understand what Filip is referring to, because that's a very cool nod. Kudos to you, sir.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about, like, the now, besides Eskara, the other characters, the villains, so as to speak, because in this book we don't really get, especially the first book, we don't really get don't get to know who the exact villain is. We just kind of get to sense that, well, the first book, again, for our viewers and for our readers, for our listeners, it is set in a subterranean pit. That's the story. Like, it's Eskara and Joseph, her fellow magician or sorcerer, are trapped in this subterranean pit where they are forced to dig without any reason, so as to speak. And her reason is, and her basically the whole story is about them wanting to escape this pit, rightfully so. But one thing which really was cool was that, we aren't really given like a so-called villain, so as to speak, in this book. At least in the series, Philip, we do find out that there's more villains, there's more characters as well. But what did you feel about this part, like, the fact that there was no obvious villain besides the one-note characters who were torturing them? They're not really villainish, they're just there to do their job, but there's no obvious villain, so as to speak, in the story, besides the pit itself being like this hellscape which they want to escape.
I think that's exactly why it works, because of the pit. Because while the pit is not a humanoid villain that is possessed of some sort of, interest that goes against what the character is doing, it is a very relatable issue. It stands between Eskara and her newfound allies and her friend, and it stands between them and their freedom. And this drive towards freedom is very much relatable, especially when it is the drive for freedom of what, a 15-year-old girl, if I remember correctly. That's how old she is at the time of the first book.
Yep.
So the struggles that this 15-year-old girl has to go through, no matter her anger, no matter the monstrous things that she has been forced to do, that she believes are right for her to do at the point at which we pick up with her. No matter any of that, it is immediately a relatable issue, because no 15-year-old should ever have to face the horror and darkness of the depths of this Sisyphean prison.
That is, she is a child. Now, you brought up this fascinating point. She is a child soldier, so as to speak. We have had some literature about child soldiers, and the psychology that goes into making one. That I feel like Rob Hayes kind of, by showing us the prequel aspect of how they were trained, it's really fascinating. I don't know, I can't speak, because I'm no expert, I can't really speak of how much effective it was, but you brought this fascinating point that she is a teenager essentially who is forced into this prison against her will, obviously, and then is forced to endure so many hardships. That kind of drove her a lot, but also it made her resentful against her so-called ally, Joseph, so as to speak, in this book, because we kind of find out how she and him came into being into this whole subterranean pit. Now, I found that to be a very fascinating counterpoint to the story, that she was angry at him, but she also loved him in a way, because he was her last connection to what their world was before. Did you feel the same way? Did you have that same connection, or am I reading too much into that?
No, I definitely felt that in that first book, the relationship between Eskara and Joseph is the leading one, and definitely what defines each character to a serious degree is the fact that they are the foils to one another. Where Eskara is angry, Joseph is biding his time and always patient. Where she is full of this desire to resist, he is much more pliable. Where she makes one choice, he often will make another. And that, I don't believe, is any kind of a spoiler, because you will get that from like the first interaction onwards.
Yes.
Joseph is one of the most fascinating characters of this entire series, and each book adds to that in ways that vary from the sweetest to what I would say are some truly horrific elements of their relationship, especially once we get into later books.
Yes, that is true.
Yeah, it's very difficult not to just applaud Rob for this particular relationship, I think.
Talking about her relationships, because with Joseph, she has a complicated past. Well, not so much complicated past, but she has a complicated present, and of course, the events of the pit exacerbate that. Their relationship doesn't really. I don't want to say it's ends up on the wrong foot. That's for the readers to decide. But it kind of ends in a more complex place than it was before. What do you think about her relationships with the other characters that she finds within the pit? Because there's some really weird ones as well. And of course, we're not going to spoil things for the readers, but just like we can. I think we can mention some of the characters that she meets normally.
Well, I would have absolutely jumped into one of the characters she does not meet normally, but let's just say that there is Hart and there is Tamara, who are two of the mainstays of the series, and both of them are very important to Eskara in very different ways. Tamara is, in many ways, he plays a very interesting role. He is a madman, but he is also a sort of holy fool, if you will, where he is speaking truth to power and speaking truths that, well, are very much not what many creatures of power throughout the series would like to hear. He is a creature of mystery, a man of more questions than answers at just about any point in the series, and someone I grew to enjoy so much that I, as someone who plays Dungeons and Dragons, I have literally been working on a whole mega dungeon that is revolving around a character inspired by him. So that's the kind of inspiring characters that we have in this book.
That's high praise, and kudos to you for doing that. I found, you mentioned, him being a holy fool. That's a very accurate description for him, because he often speaks in riddles, and I'm sure, similar to Eskara, we the reader are also conflicted. Like, what is he saying? What is he joking? Is he not joking? Or is he just because when Eskara first kind of meets him, the grapevine around the pit is that Tamura has lost his mind. And it is easily apparent to the readers why that is the case, because whenever he speaks, whenever he opens his mouth, there's always something funny coming out. But it is totally different to what is happening around them, and that was really, it added a comic element to the story. Hart, on the other hand, was a little bit different, and of course, like you mentioned, that they're both mainstays of Eskara's life, and for our viewers and listeners, you can probably, when you read the book, you'll understand why. We are, again, no spoilers, but you can see because their progression, they each have character arcs, all of them matter, and then along with Joseph, Hart, and Tamura, and of course certain other people, there's more that happens as well. Philip, I wanted to ask you, because the first book, let's talk a little bit, shifting from the characters, I want to talk a little bit about the series, the way it's structured as a whole, because I believe and I know you mentioned this as well, the books when they came out, they were a trilogy at first, and then Rob revealed, later on at the end of the third book, that it's not a trilogy, now it's going to be a series, because there's 2 more books coming as well. What do you think about that? Were you happy with that? Were you miffed at him? Were you just be like, oh yeah, more Eskara? That's always good.
Oh, I was definitely thrilled, because Eskara is one of those characters that I could probably read her adventures if all that she did all day was just taking care of 5 goats and a mule.
Sure.
So I expected to love the next stories that Rob told with her, and surprise, surprise, now that I've read them, I sure as hell did. It was an absolute joy, really, to know that there was more to look forward to. And one of my great regrets back when Sins of the Mother was just about to come out was that Rob sent me this ARC, this early access review copy, advanced reader copy, whatever they call them. And I didn't have the time at all to read it until December, until just before That's Beating Heart came out. And that regret actually was what transformed into my desire to, in a way, make it up to Rob and be like, yeah, I'm going to now review all the books on my YouTube channel. And that's what I ended up doing. And that, I think, is how we've ended up in this enjoyable conversation of ours.
Yes.
But did you feel that same kind of excitement when you found out that 2 more books, or any number of books, were coming? Because I don't think we knew at that point that they were just going to be 2.
So for me, and maybe you can speak more to this as well. Like when the books, at the end of the 3rd book, the way the story ends, you feel like there's a solid conclusion. There's like the story that Eskara progresses through from the pit to where she ends up with at the end of book 3. It seemed like a proper conclusion. And this is really hard to speak again without spoilers, but I'll just say that the Eskara of book 1 is not the Eskara of book 3. So in that regards, I felt like there was a proper conclusion, and I was happy if Rob would have ended it over there. I'm not saying that because I do look. In fact, book 4, and I want to hear about you as well, is my favorite book of the series. Having read all 5, somehow book 4 for me was the best book for me in terms of what it did, and in terms of the entire series as well. But for I was of course happy because then it was going to be, and there's, maybe you can speak to this as well, there was going to be a time jump, and that is exactly what it is. Like books 3, the first trilogy, is an earlier part of Eskara's life. Books 4 and 5, which is a duology, are a latter part of Eskara's life, and of course they continue the whole story. But for me, I would have been happy if it had ended over there, but I'm still ecstatic that we got the remaining 2 books, because book 4 was my favorite book. And so I do ask you as well, like which is your favorite book now that you've read all 5?
I honestly can't decide between books 4 and 5, because they so naturally come together in a way. I love what book 4 does, because it's a mixture of some of the tricks, if you will, that Rob uses in book 1, but it shows us such a matured version of Eskara, and it is an absolute joy to catch up to her much closer to the way that her future self is writing in those first 3 books. And I think that is what is absolutely a success in this series, the way that Eskara just progresses, always onwards, always upwards as a character from book 1 to 5. It's just an amazing amount of growth for any character. But yeah, maybe book 4 is mine as well, because and I'm not afraid to say that the cover of book 4 is my absolute favorite of the lot. Just seeing Eskara as this older woman, she has such poise, such elegance, and she's also very, very haughty, and I love that.
Yes. For our viewers, this is the artwork for it. This artwork is done by Felix Ortiz, and this hardcover was designed by Sean T. King. They are the indie wondermen, so as to speak. Sean T. King and Felix Ortiz, they have done so many covers. Fun fact, according to Dirk Ashton, and I don't know if you can see this, but this skeleton is him as a homage to Dirk Ashton, loving Eskara. So I just thought that was very funny, and I wanted to point that out. But I do agree with you, these covers are just brilliant. I don't know, I'm thankful that Rob went with the way he did, that he had different covers, and my apologies as well. I do not have the paperbacks with me. I of course read them in the Kindle, similar to you. I just had to buy these hardcovers because they're just so gorgeous, and I wanted to support Rob and Felix and Sean. Coming back to what we're talking about, Sins of the Murders is kind of both our favorite, and That's Beating Heart. Those 2 books are a little bit more they feel more like a duology. They are of course 2 halves, so to speak, because events of the 4th book influence the events of the fifth book, but then the fifth book also brings a conclusion to the whole series. Is it a happy conclusion? Is it a sad conclusion? That's for the readers to decide for themselves, because, again, like Eskara, you can never really say one thing or the other. But, compared to, I want to get this
we
for more.
could say, well, sorry to interrupt, but we could say that it definitely lives up to its name. That's the best judgment of the whole series we could give at this point without getting into spoilers.
Yes, that is very true. It is, as Filip put it, it lives up to its series name, and of course we can't say why, because you'll have to read the books or watch the episode with Rob J. Hayes, because then we'll be discussing a lot of spoilers about the series. But I wanted to get your opinion about, which ending, compared to the third book or the fifth book, which felt more thematic to you, which, with this, again, with the series themes or with Eskara's character.
Oh, no question about it. The fifth book's ending definitely was much more thematic than the third one. I really enjoyed the third book ending, and if this was all there was to Eskara's adventures, it would have been one of my favorite book series of 2020, no question about it. It would have probably made it to like the top 15 of my book series of the whole decade, if you will. But I don't know that it would have been like something that, the way it is now, is a series that I will gladly reread from start to finish time and again, the same way as I would reread, say, Steven Eriksson's The Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Why did you say that? Why would you say that, that you cannot read it the same way? Is it because of things that you already know, or is it just because of the impact is less when you're going into it, before knowing, not knowing anything?
I mean that I will definitely reread it.
Okay, sorry. My apologies. I didn't really understand you.
I might have fumbled with some words. Apologies for that.
No, not at all. Let's talk a little bit more about this, series before we go on to the aspects of the plot, because I know, there's a lot more to the plot as well. I believe you mentioned that, that you read them because Rob did a rapid release of the first 3 books, and you read them along with the rapid release because you had gotten early ARCs, Filip?
Yeah, I did, and that was great. That was a really fun experience. I'd done that once before with Ben Gully's trilogy,
Chasing Graves.
Chasing Graves. Yep.
Yes. He actually was inspired. Rob actually, I think in one of his interviews had mentioned, I don't know if it was with you or with somebody else, but he actually had mentioned that, that he was inspired because of that Ben Gally kind of coerced him into releasing. I feel like that was like a strong point of, that was really a strong point for the story, because, the first 3 books, when they came in back to back to back within a space of, 3 months, like you got one book at every 1 month interval, it fed into the narrative because it kind of, again, there was the narrative energy, it had pace, and then you got the books really as quickly as possible. So that kind of helped as well. You didn't have to wait too long if you were the quick reader. Or of course, if you're the slow person, not slow, but if you're the slower reader, you could still know that the books are out, and once you finish book 1, you could get into book 2 immediately, and book 3 as well. For me, I found that books 2 and 3 were a lot quicker pace, so as to speak, than book 1. Was that the case for you, Filip, or was it even throughout?
For me, the only the only time I struggled with the pacing of the series was actually during the first third of book 2. That was the one part of it when I felt like Eskara's monologuing, her self-reflection rather, was slowing down the pace of the story more than I was comfortable with. Whereas the first book, while it does only take place in one place, more or less, it is nonetheless very much, it works more as a character study almost. So for me, that helped with the slower pace. It might have been of slower pace, but I didn't mind it. It didn't matter to me, to my reading experience.
Perfect. And so, actually, we both of us would be very interested for readers and listeners to maybe put in as well their thoughts as to how they found the books, if they have read them. Which books did they find slower pace, or did they find them all to be exciting? Moving on to the plot, because I know, Filip, you have gotten some excellent points about the plot and wanting to, specifically talk about that. So there's I know you had mentioned, to me before, like there's two aspects to this plot, so to speak. That it's not just a revenge story, because that's how it's presented to us at first. Like it's not just a revenge story, but there's more to it. Would you care to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. It masks itself as a revenge story to begin with, but it grows from there, because Eska finds out that although revenge sounds really great in theory, it's first off super difficult to get in this dark world that she lives in. And also, she is not entirely ready to pay the cost of it. I think that's not really a spoiler. It's something that she learns for herself firsthand in various ways. And the way she comes to grips with the real cost of vengeance, well, there for the readers to discover.
That is true. And also, fun fact for the readers and listeners, the title of the second book is The Lessons Never Learned. That is literally what that can be a banner point for Eska, that she never learns her lessons and she still forges on upwards and onwards, as Philip mentioned. And in this case, not a spoiler, literally upwards, because you'll see that in book 2 why that happens. I found that to be, the plot of this, talking about the plot of the first, each book was its own thing. Like, the plot of the first book was this whole escape from a subterranean prison. The plot of the second book is more of like, that now that they're out of the prison, again, not a spoiler, that's the book blurb, that what is in the world. You kind of find that there's a lot more to this world. It's not just like a low fantasy world, right? Opposite. It's actually a high fantasy world, because there's so many races, there's so many things happening, there's, things happening in the sky. Did you find that to be, how do you like that sort of mix in your fantasy, Philip? Or do you, have preferences when it comes to fantasy about certain things being the way they should be?
It definitely depends on how well the author of a series pulls it off. In this case, Rob does an amazing job of it. He introduces these races, and at first you're not quite sure how to feel about them, but then he adds more and more contours to them, makes them more real as time goes on. And you realize the relationship these races have with creatures that might have been met earlier on, which it creates a sense of depth, and a sense of a world that really has had this lived-in quality to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I found it to be just a wonderful place for an author with truly amazing skills to play around with. And there is so much that is at once mundane about these worlds and magical, and also downright eldritch. One of my favorite locations is, I think it's mentioned fairly early on, a hole in the sky above an oasis in the middle of the world's greatest desert.
Yes.
And it is such a striking visual theme to this world. And it stays with you. And as you might imagine, it is not just a one-off comment. It comes to play an important role later down the line. And the things that Rob Hayes does with this one throwaway line in the first book, they just blow the mind.
That was such a cool thing, right? Like, and for our readers, what Philip is referring to, and maybe for the people who read the first book, this is again not a spoiler. There's a throwaway line about the world having a hole about the Great Polynesian Desert, or Polynesian Desert. Sorry, my apologies, I might be messing that up. But there's a hole, and there's an eye that looks through the sky, and everybody thinks that it's some benevolent creature, or maybe it's just God looking through. Whatever that might be, that's for the readers to find out, and you do find out. That's really a cool thing, that you mentioned eldritch, Philip. You could construe it as that, what I really loved was this world felt, like you mentioned, lived in, and it had a thousands of year old history as well. You know, that the world force goes as far back as possible. In fact, both of us could agree that, Rob could maybe write another book series in it set in the past, and it could be its own thing. It could be like a, another high fantasy series, because that's what the world is about, like the war eternal. There is a war going on in this world for thousands of years, and of course the readers will find out what that is. There's many races as well. There are those Pahat, there's the Garns, there's those, absolutely inhuman, the Jinn and the Rand, which are two fascinating sets of inhuman characters, so as to speak. I don't know how else would
godlike
you...
entities. I
godlike
would
entities.
describe them as godlike entities is a good way to do it.
And they were really they get really introduced from the second. Of course, they're mentioned in the first book, but you really get a sense of who and what they are from the second book onwards. As Eskara and the other characters, tend to have more and more dealings with, what they have wrecked on the world as well. With regards to this world, you mentioned that it felt lived in, it felt really exciting. Were there any things that, perhaps you didn't enjoy? Because I do have some aspects of it. I would like to talk about that after you do.
Honestly, I can't come up with something that really felt off for me in terms of the world building.
Mm-hmm.
I have a very selective memory. So if there was something that I disliked early on, for example, in the pit, there's a good likelihood that I have completely just erased it from mind. But I would love to hear what your issues are and see if what you say clicks with me.
Oh yeah, sure. The one thing which I felt, which, and of course this is on purpose, because the Eskara, I felt like the world history was lacking, and let me explain why I felt that. Because Eskara as a character gets introduced, she's obviously being taught only a few things. She comes from a small village, and then she's taken away by the Terran or Oran, I think the Oran emperors, and his, first the school of magic, and then of course we get bits and pieces of the world, and it doesn't always make sense. So for me as a reader, like, from a world building perspective, it was always confusing. I'm like, wait a second, this maybe is not jiving with what we have been told or what we are seeing. So for me, that was kind of like, in the first book at least, that was, or for the world history, because we often get mentioned that this world is like thousands of years old, and I was like, if the world is thousands of years old, there has to be more, for the human perspective, there has to be more better recollection of what has happened or what has come before. Now, of course, that is just my archaic way of thinking, just from our basic human history, because there's always myths and legends that grow on. But, if you see in this world, or at least in this series, there's not really a lot of human myths and legends that are there in that world. There's bits and pieces which get mentioned, or maybe it could just be that because Eskara's a sole POV, we only get her perspective, and she's not really caring about that, because as a child,
I think that was definitely what helped me with that aspect, because I also like, the layered sense of history, but knowing who Eskara was and knowing this was all through her perspective, that really helped. And the way that the world was aged for me was through characters like Tamara and Hart, who did actually have a lot of that knowledge and brought some of it into Eskara's life and perspective through their own experience and attempts at guidance, if you will. But I definitely get why you struggle with that to begin with. I think it comes more and more into play in the latter books, and especially, again, the fourth book. It feels the sense of history is there much more than it is in, say, the first.
That is true. Yeah, that's a very well, but maybe that's why the fourth book is, both yours and my favorite, because it kind of gives you a solid sense of what the world is, what has happened before, and then of course what will or does happen in that sense. Do you is there anything else about the the plot that you would like to discuss more, or should we move on to the world building aspects of it?
I think I'm good for now. Nothing comes to mind.
Nothing does come to mind. So let's talk about the world building, because for both you and me, this was a world that that excited us, and of course for many others, it was the same. Now, the story in the first book kind of it's almost, even though this is an epic fantasy book, it kind of seems low fantasy-ish because there's not really a lot of magic that's happening. It's kind of grounded. And of course, rightfully so, because as we find out, Eska and the way magic works in this world is that they have to ingest stones or ingest gems, which kind of gives them the power. But of course, there's a limit to what they can ingest. And then, because they're in the pit, obviously they do not have access to their sources or the gemstones, and hence there is nothing like that. But when the story progresses from the second book onwards, it kind of almost becomes like high fantasy. So it goes beyond epic fantasy, and we get this really strange alienistic world, hole in the sky, there being like a shadow world mentioned, creatures coming out, because these sorcerers are able to pull these really horrible and horrific creatures from another world into there to fight each other, and so to speak.
And the most interesting aspect of that particular school of magic, it's called impermanency in the War Eternal. It's not that you crack open a portal and pull a creature out, is that you almost give it a sort of magical birth, if you will, because the creatures, they might come out of your stomach. You might throw up a magical, a demonic nightmare entity, or it might come out of the cuts on your hands or your wounds, and it is a gruesome kind of magic. And all of the magical system really has a very gruesome, very savage element to it, exactly because it involves this ingestion of sources, which themselves have so much thought put behind them, and their essence is something we're not obviously going to get into because it's very spoiler centric. But it once Rob reveals the truth behind the sources, you will just slap your forehead and be like, of course it's that. It could never have been anything else. It's an elegant system, isn't it? I found that it was because the actual way that magic functions outside of the mechanical swallowing of the stones, it is not super different in many ways from your very classical archetypal schools of magic, but the execution, of course, makes it so much more different. And I don't know about you, I'd love to, but I fell in love with it from the get-go. And I think a lot of my interest in that first book was literally me just waiting to see what would happen when inevitably, that's no spoiler, seeing as, inevitably Eska would get her hands on the Soul's Stone.
That is true. I love that, because literally in the first book, we through her past, we kind of get to see what are the potential aspects of these stones, and like you so veritably mentioned, Philip, like there's a huge mystery about them. Like, what are they? Where do they come from? And for our viewers and listeners, there's a huge payoff. Like, this is the one thing which Philip and Philip has already mentioned, and I would like to heartily endorse. Every mystery in this world, everything is tied, it gets tied back into the mythology, and all of it is beautifully explained. Like, I don't know how Rob did it. I don't know how much thinking he had to do and how much of his head hurt while doing and trying to get everything lined up. But believe me, from the first book onwards till the last book, every mystery that's kind of exposed on the page, there's a reason, there's a process, there's a proper explanation, and it all gets tied in. It's so cool to find out at the end, or like towards the end, not even like all the way in the end. You kind of get these answers in book 3 as well. Like, what is truly happening? What are these sources? Where do they come from? Why, like you mentioned, like, how are they so horrific? Why is it ingesting them so hard? And everything makes sense. Like, oh, and another fun aspect, there are 2 moons in the world. If I'm not wrong, there's a red moon and there's a blue moon, the Lursa and something else, Luna, Lursa. I might be mispronouncing them, but there's a story to that too, like, why they are the way they are. I love that aspect. For me as a reader, like, when yes, characters and the plot are always going to be a strong point, but when the world building is this exciting, when the world building is this drastically different, that drives me in even more. Is it the same for you, Philip? Are you more like a character reader, or like does the plot, you need the plot to be stronger, or is world building something that you truly, focus on?
Honestly, I think I'm one of those readers who, as long as what's in the story works, I'm good with it. I don't usually read a book for certain elements of it. I'm always going to try and judge a book based on what's there. And if what's there isn't good enough, I'll just not, deal with it. But I think it was just a perfect gathering of all the right ingredients here. And I mean, was there any one aspect that to you felt that it didn't live up to the others in this one, in this series?
Let me think. I would say that's a little bit like the one thing maybe which perhaps I would have allowed, but it's again it's huge spoiler, so I can't it's character based. Like I would have wished that maybe one or two characters had gotten their own POV just a little bit, so we could get a little bit insight into their thoughts. But I cannot mention their names because again that's their spoilers. So I'm going to refrain for that. But everything else, like world building wise, no, I had no complaints. Like this was, in fact, I would say this book was better than the world building wise. This book is better. It's the best one that Rob has published so far.
I think so.
His first third saga, his the It Takes a Thief books, his Mortal Techniques, and I love those Mortal Techniques books as well. So do
I
you,
haven't read
Philip?
the third one yet, but this first and second one are
so mind-blowing, right? So yeah, but like the world building aspect of them versus this one, I feel like the War Tunnel saga, the way he has concretely thought of and how everything ties in together is unbeatable so far. Maybe he'll write something else and that'll blow all of our minds again, and we'll be like, holy shit, he did it again. So fingers crossed for that. But no, I loved it. There was nothing for me to complain from a world building perspective. Like for me, the world building was just the chef's kiss, and I maybe in the future, again, when SPFPO ends or something like that, I would love to do a reread of all 5 books. I have read the 5th book as well. I haven't reviewed it. Sorry, Rob. But eventually I hope to do review it, because it was I was a bit not unhappy, but I was a bit sad after the 5th book ended, knowing that it has come to an end, just because I wanted it to be more. And even though there's so much thing going on in the 5th book as well. But that's a thing for the review. I'll talk about that later.
I really hope that there is a sequel series, because that's no spoiler, but there is definitely the potential for a sequel series based off of at least 2-3 characters I can think of in a heartbeat.
Oh yeah. In fact, I do have a question. Maybe this will be a good question for the spoiler section when we do with Rob. Like, because there's and we can maybe talk more about this in the spoilers, but there's like few things which happen in like book 4 which kind of make me think that maybe, just maybe, there might be a sequel series, but not in the way that we think there will be like a true sequel. But some of these characters might be coming somewhere, or something might be happening. But we can kind of bother Rob with it, when we about that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Let's talk a little bit more about like the darkness aspect of this world, because I know a lot of readers have mentioned that, even in the reviews. I was just reading through the reviews, and there was this whole aspect of like, oh, this book is dark, the book gets darker and darker, and that is to speak. This whole series was a very there was a very, not weird, but there was a different amalgamation. Like, it's like dark fantasy, but it's not grim dark, or do you think it's grim dark, Philip?
No, I don't really take the grimdark etiquette, grimdark label too seriously. I think it did start off as a joke, and I think most, like for example, someone like Joe Abercrombie uses grimdark very sarcastically, very ironically, and I think that the books that take themselves really seriously as grimdark usually aren't perfectly good books. No offense to if you enjoy super grimdark books, all the power to you, dear viewer. But the ones I've read that label themselves unironically as grimdark, never too great. So to me, this is absolutely dark fantasy. Yes, it can be categorized as epic fantasy, or rather, the way I would categorize it is dark fantasy with aspects of epic and high fantasy as well.
That is very true. The high fantasy aspect is what I want to talk about, because the dark fantasy aspect. I just want to make the clarification just for our viewers, because I know there's a subset of readers who will only read grimdark, and perhaps there's always a tricky part about what is grimdark. Of course, nobody knows the definition of grimdark versus what is grimdark, but what is dark. I feel like this book is, it has dark elements, it has aspects, or it is dark fantasy, so to speak, but it's not grimdark. There's nothing horrific about it. And then the one thing, yeah, so that being there, again, I'll keep my mouth shut about what that spoiler thing is. But let's talk about the high fantasy elements. We haven't really gotten, and maybe I'm not read enough, but in the last few years, maybe the last decade or so, we have epic fantasies, we have dark fantasies, but we haven't really gotten like a proper high fantasy series. I mean, Malazan is a whole different beast, so I'm gonna keep that aside, because that is a whole different thing. It's never just one thing; it's a whole different thing. But besides Malazan or Malazan, I don't know how it's pronounced. Uh, can you think of anything else, Philip, that match the high fantasy aspect of this world? I
Honestly, I haven't been reading that much in terms of fantasy. I can't think of anything, yes, that I've read anyway in recent times that has a really strong high fantasy aspect. I've recently started a book by I think the author was Verdi.
Oh, R.R. Verdi, the first binding?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
The first binding. That seemed to have some high fantasy aspects, but I've only just read like maybe 15% of it.
Oh,
so
it's a big book, yeah.
If you've read it,
I did.
have
It's
you?
Yeah, it's epic only. It's only epic. It's not it's so well, yeah, let me rephrase. Do you There's a
Maybe
mention of it.
we should probably just like define what we mean by high and epic, as in
Yes.
what's the main difference, do you think?
So I believe in my mind, and of course I could be wrong about this, high fantasy is when the presence of magic and gods, or beings other than humans, it's like an everyday occurrence. It's there, it affects every aspect of everybody's living, and there's like the world is as fantastic as it can be. That's high fantasy for me. Epic fantasy, on the other hand, is again, depending on which aspect of our world it's modeled on. It can be medieval, it can be non-European, it can be Asian, whatever that be. There is a presence of magic in the world, but magic is kind of, it's not exactly contained. Again, the hard soft magic system, all of that is separate, but magic can be only be used by certain few, or like by like it's like the forbidden fruit. Like, it's there, you can see its effects, but not everybody can use it. And sometimes, depending on the author's writing, like in this case, magic can exact a terrible price. Like, in this world, magic has an absolutely horrendous price to pay. So there's that for me is like, in my mind, like epic versus high fantasy. So that's why this series is, it kind of, in a way, kind of confusing, because you have that high fantasy aspect of these alien races, the sky, the hole in the sky, the Jinn and the Rand, them being a vital part of this world, and them literally changing the aspects of this world at literally like Thanos, like clicking their fingers, some of that.
Yeah.
But what do you think, Philip?
No, yeah, I would have to agree with you 100%, because for me, maybe dark fantasy it's more a descriptor of a mood than it is of elements, whereas high fantasy, as you say, very much like a descriptor of elements. And these elements, I don't recall reading any fantasy in the last 2-3 years that has these elements of high fantasy in the way that this series does. And the way that this series pulls them off, they feel impactful, they feel eventful, and they always leave a strong impression.
That they do. Well, we're almost coming to a close of our discussion, and this has been such a fascinating one. But I do, before we end up and before we wrap up, I do want to talk a little bit more about the alienistic aspects of these books. We at several time points we have mentioned the Ran and the Jinn. Now should we talk about? What do you think? Should we talk about a little bit more about those races, about who they are, what they are, or do you think that's too much spoilers for the books?
Honestly, I think sure, it's a bit of spoilers, but it's nothing that isn't evident fairly early on, if not in book 1, then in book 2, and it's not something that spoils the actual plot. It's an element of the world building, so I think we're good.
Okay, good. So I'm not like I'm fine with spoilers, but I know people absolutely dislike spoilers. So I'm always worried about what is actual spoiler versus what's maybe not a spoiler for me. So I always want to make that distinction.
Honestly, I'm glad you're here, because usually I know that people care about them. I myself very rarely do, and so I'm like, okay, I'll blur this out, except maybe I shouldn't, because
it's
someone
fun.
who might read the books. It is great to Anyway, go on.
You could spoil the story for me and I will still read it and I'll still enjoy it. For me, spoilers are not a big deal. Somebody could tell me the entire plot of the story and I'll read it and I'll be like, okay, this was fun, and I had the added insight. So anyways, that being said,
same way.
So let's talk more about these races. Now, the Jinn and the Rand, I found them to be very fascinating, because the Jinn, in a weird way, share some aspects of the Jinn that we find in our world, or at least the histories or the mythologies that are present in the other world. But the Rand are completely alienistic, and of course the series title gives a hint as to what who these things are, or what they might be focusing upon. When you found out about them, when you're reading them, what did you think about them? And maybe I'll talk a little bit more about afterwards as well.
They are very much inspired, I think, by an elemental sort of conflict between two very different sets of elements. And I think it's no spoiler to define one as more air and fire, and the other one as earth and water. Was that the pairings?
I believe so.
I think that's the one.
Yeah.
And they're fascinating. The way that Eskara describes them at one point is they're like the gods of our world. And she immediately denies that as soon as she says it, but there is a lot there that is then visited and revisited. And the role of these creatures, their role as deities, their role as supporting characters to the storyline of this world, if you will. It just it's a lot. It's fascinating to read about.
That is true. Because you're talking about this, one thing just kind of popped back in my head. Another thing which kind of didn't irk me, but I was very curious about, was why is there no religion in this world? Because that's the one thing which I was curious about in the books, because again, going off of human nature and going off, like you mentioned, there are these creatures in the soul which are thought of as gods, but they're not. And I know we do get some small subset of religion, because the people who worship the eye in the sky. But that's a very small subset. But I found
it's more cults than religions.
True.
We definitely see a lot of cults, but we never see an organized religion. I think maybe later on we see the seeds of a religion or two. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
But, the actual big time religious organizations are completely lacking in this world, and I think I might have something of an idea about why, but I'm not sure whether that again isn't entering into spoiler territory.
Maybe we'll ask it to Rob. Maybe you can keep that thread in your mind, so that way when you ask it to Rob, because that'll be a chock full of spoilers. But yeah, that was the thing. I was very curious about that. why is there no religion in this world? What has happened? Because you can mention the cults part of it. That's true. There's like these small cults, but we don't really get like a big organized religion. And maybe that's maybe Rob can reveal that to us as to why that is the case, or what's happening in this world. But this is another thing, which is sometimes keeps me up about this world. Like, and I keep on thinking about like what happened, what happens, what will happen later on, or what if Eskara hadn't done this, or what if this person had maybe interceded as well. So this was fun. Thank you so much again, Philip, for your time today and for talking to me about all of these. For our viewers and listeners, we will be listing all of our links in below. This will be posted on the Fantasy Book Critic YouTube channel, and then watch out for the part 2 of this conversation, which we'll be joined by Rob J. Hayes, author of the War Eternal Saga, the Mortal Techniques books, the First Earth Saga, the It Takes a Thief series, Titan Hoppers, and God knows how many other books. He writes a lot, don't you think?
He does. He absolutely, that man, there's no stopping him.
Yes, and thankfully so, because we both happen to love his books, and I'm sure there are many more other people who love his books as well. So he is a force for good in this world in a way that he keeps us entertained as well as gives us things to talk about.
He has very little to do with Rand and Jin, I think.
For the listeners, you have to read the books to figure out what Philip meant by this. So yeah. Philip,
thank you very much for having me, for extending the invitation. I was very, very happy when you texted me on Twitter and were like, "Hey, want to talk about this book series?" I was like, "Yes."
I love your YouTube reviews, because your YouTube reviews are so fun and so informative, because the way you talk about, you break down everything, every aspect of the books. I was like, this is really cool. I always wanted to talk to somebody about these books, and of course there's not that many people who have read them, or at least read them in the full way. So you can only talk about like certain aspects of it. So I'm like, okay, Philip has read it, let me ask him if he has the time. So this was amazing. Thank you again for your time.
Likewise.
And before you go, can you tell us, our readers, where they can, or viewers and listeners, where they can find you, and what are you reading next or currently?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right now, you can find me on Twitter at the Filip Magnus. You can find me on my blog, the Grimoire Reliquary, and you can find me on YouTube at Filip Magnus. There's also an Instagram thing I use, which is very random, so you don't need to follow me on that one. But what am I reading right now? That is I'm actually beta reading. I'm about to begin beta reading a new novel by Benedict Patrick.
I think I know which one you're talking about. That is very cool. Very, very, very cool that you've gotten a copy of that book.
I'm very excited. Benedict is amazing. He is. I mean, for me, there are like 5 fantasy indie authors that I try to keep up with. I haven't been doing a great job of it this last year, but I'm trying to get back on track. And Rob Hayes is one, Benedict Patrick is another. And I think we also mentioned Ben Galley, who is also one of those. And each of them, they have absolutely everything you would expect in published fiction. If anyone is, operating under this idea that published, rather than
traditionally
indie,
published,
fantasy, traditionally published, thank you. Fantasy is better than indie. You just need to read their works and the works of many other indie authors to know, no, there are people in the indie space that working right now, writing as well as anyone out there in the traditionally published sector.
And for those viewers who haven't read Benedict's works, there's Jan's World book series. These are only 3 of the books. I just happen to have them. This was truly a coincidence.
I actually have 2 of them.
Oh, nice.
Here as well.
Yay! So yes, and Philip has different ones as well. So yeah, please check them out. Benedict Patrick is amazing. He writes so lyrically. He writes beautifully. Hence, Jan's World is full of different mythologies existing in the same world. It is just so cool.
Folklore as much as you can ever need, and possibly more.
Yes, I'm very excited to hear more when you're done with Benedict's new book, because I kind of have know about it, and so I'm excited for him, to kind of begin this new series, and maybe he'll become even more popular, because that's what I want. Benedict Patrick is a
Yeah,
person who should be more popular.
he
He deserves
definitely
that.
is.
All right. Well, I'll be listing all of Philip's links below, and we will be looking forward to everyone joining us in hopefully a couple of weeks, a little bit more, on Philip's channel, where you all can maybe jump in and see what we like. It'll be full of spoilers for the Wartle saga, and joining us will be author Rob J. Hayes. So thank you to everyone. I hope you all have a lovely day. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.